Hi everyone, it's Michelle here. Welcome back to Grounded Haven Homestead. Today I have some more pantry challenge meals to bring you. I've been having so much fun creating these videos and I'm really glad you guys have been liking them. So I've got some new recipes to share. Of course, just using everything that was in our pantry, not going to the store, and trying to use as much homegrown and home preserved stuff as possible. So let's get started. First off, I'm going to prepare a few things for the week. I have a couple of different bread recipes I want to make. I have hamburger buns, which we're going to be using for some vegetarian pulled pork sandwiches. And then I'm also going to be making a sandwich bread. I'm using this classic sandwich bread recipe I have, but one of the loaves is going to be a cinnamon raisin swirl bread. So I'm going to be using the filling ingredients for this other recipe I have here. I'm just going to make the dough for the classic bread and split it in half to make one loaf cinnamon raisin swirl bread. And I'm going to start off with this dough. This dough has 6 cups of flour. I'm using 5 cups of regular all-purpose and 1 cup of whole wheat bread flour. And then I'm just going to dump all of the ingredients in my stand mixer bowl. By the way, whenever I am baking with commercial yeast, I'm always using instant yeast and I never activate it, which is when you put it in warm water with some sugar and wait for it to get foamy. I don't think that this step is actually necessary. It's only to check if your yeast is actually alive. And I know my yeast is alive because I bake with it all the time and my bread always rises. So I always skip this step and I throw my yeast straight in with the rest of the ingredients, and this always works out great for me. So I just need this in my stand mixer for a few minutes until it is nice and smooth and it's tacky but not sticky. And I'm just gonna move this to another bowl because I am going to be making that other bread in the same stand mixer bowl. And I usually don't oil my bowls either. I usually end up putting too much oil and it's really hard to get the dough to stick on itself, which is really important for shaping. So I usually just skip the oil and I don't have a problem with that. So I'm going to move on to the other dough, which are the hamburger buns. In another video, I showed how to make hamburger buns that had some potato flakes in it to make a potato hamburger bun, but this is going to be more of a classic one, so it doesn't have those potato flakes, and this one has milk and butter, so it's a little bit of an enriched dough. And other than that, it's pretty basic. I'm doing mostly all-purpose flour, 3 cups of that, and then just half a cup of the whole wheat bread flour, because I want this to be pretty much a white hamburger bun that you would buy in the store. But I had my whole wheat flour out anyway, so I just thought I'd add in just a smidge of that. And then this recipe also has an egg in it and a little bit of melted butter. So again, that's gonna knead in the stand mixer until it's nice and smooth. And I'm just gonna give it a couple of turns just to smooth it out a little bit, and then I'm going to cover this, and both of these doughs need to rise for at least an hour. So while I set those aside and have this time waiting for them to rise, I'm going to put together the filling for the cinnamon raisin bread. So the filling is really easy. It's just sugar, a little bit of all-purpose flour, raisins, and some cinnamon. The flour is pretty important because I think it helps to keep that swirl a little bit more distinct. So that's a nice addition in this recipe. I found that helps a lot. And I'm just going to mix this up and try and separate those raisins since they tend to clump up, and just mix all that cinnamon throughout, and we're just going to set this aside so that it's ready to use later when our dough is all nice and risen. Now I'm going to move on to one other thing for this week. I have all of this cowboy candy syrup that I need to use up. I have a few jars of this canned, and I also have some leftover syrup in the fridge from when we finished off a jar. And I also have some tomato sauce. I used some of this last week for our garlic knots. And I found this really cool recipe online for a barbecue sauce that uses cowboy candy syrup. And I thought this would be perfect because cowboy candy syrup has sugar in it and it has vinegar, 2 things that are in barbecue sauce already. And of course it has a little bit of spice because there's all those jalapenos mixed in there. So I'm going to be trying this recipe out. It's my first time making it. I just strained through my cowboy candy syrup and my tomato sauce through a sieve because it has some of those pepper seeds And also when I make my tomato sauce, I don't strain out any of those skins or seeds, and this one also had herbs in it. So I want to get those particles out so that I have a really smooth barbecue sauce. To this, I'm also adding some tomato paste. This is most of a 6-ounce jar. I just used a couple of tablespoons of this for chili last week, so I'm just using the rest of this jar up. There's also Worcestershire sauce, and this recipe has extra molasses and honey and sugar, and instead of that I'm going to be using this peach jam. I have half a jar that we had in our fridge, and I thought this would be really great because this peach jam of course is really sweet, so I think it'll take the place of some of those things, and it does kind of have like a honey flavor to it, and I know that peach barbecue sauce is a thing as well, so I just thought that this would work out really well so that I don't have to add extra sugar to this, and I just get to use another homemade home canned product. I'm also adding a few seasonings. There is onion powder, garlic powder, paprika, and some salt. And this recipe also has extra vinegar in it as well, but I'm skipping that for now. I want to keep this batch kind of small because I don't want to have to can this, so I'm trying to keep this as a small batch that we can use over the next week or two. And I don't want to add a lot of extra liquid. And I think that since I'm not going to can this, I can leave out that extra vinegar and it'll probably be a little bit more to our liking. So I just simmered this on the stovetop for 20 to 30 minutes until it starts thickening up nicely, and it's going to thicken up a little bit more as it cools. And this turned out really, really good. I am so happy with this recipe, and I have a few more jars of that cowboy candy syrup. Definitely going to use again to make this recipe because it turned out so good. I ended up not having to add any extra sugar or sweetener or vinegar. It was perfect with everything that I threw in there. And I think this would also be great for any other kind of syrup that we have, like maybe if we have extra syrup from our bread and butter pickles, because those also have a lot of sugar and that vinegar. So I think this is just a really cool recipe to know how to make now, and I'm excited to experiment more with it. This is my first time making any kind of barbecue sauce, period, so I'm really happy with it. It turned out really good, and we ended up with a quart of this homemade barbecue sauce that we're going to use for a couple of recipes this week. So now our dough is all risen. You can see this sandwich bread dough has risen a lot. The bowl was a little small for this amount of dough, but I'm gonna just set this out on my working surface and punch out some of that excess air from the first rise. I'm gonna split this in two since this is gonna make 2 loaves. For the classic sandwich bread, it's super simple. I'm patting it out into a rectangle, and I just like to pat it out with my fingers. You don't have to bring out a rolling pin or anything like that. As long as your dough is nice and soft like this, it's really easy to do with your hands. And I'm just gonna roll it up and then pinch the seams on the bottom and on the sides. That's pretty much it for this one. It's really easy. So I'm putting this in a prepared loaf pan. I have some parchment paper in there, and I've also buttered the sides, and that's gonna sit there for another 40 to 60 minutes to rise one more time. So now the cinnamon raisin one is gonna be a little bit different. Again, I'm going to just stretch and pat this out into a rectangle. I don't really worry too much about the size because you can always manipulate this later, but you want the short side to be about the length of your loaf pan. And I'm going to brush an egg wash over this surface before we put all of our filling ingredients in. This helps again to have a more distinct swirl. In the past, I've tried to skip this step because I didn't want to break open an egg to make this egg wash, and I just wanted to make things a little bit easier. But when I did skip that step, the swirl is not distinct at all and everything kind of blends together. So if you do want it to look like a swirl bread, then you do need to have this egg wash. Then after that, I'm just going to distribute the filling all over the surface. Really try and make sure you get up to the edges, because if you don't, then your end pieces of bread are not going to have that filling in there. And then just like the last one, you're gonna roll it up the short end and just roll it up all the way, not too tight, but you do want to have just a little bit of tension so that there are no big air pockets in there. And then at the very end, you can just pinch it to seal and pinch the ends as well. And then I usually tuck those ends a little bit under as well and put this into your loaf pan seam side down. So these two sandwich loaves are going to rise again for an hour. I'm also going to shape my hamburger buns at this point. So I split my dough into 8 pieces, and I'm just going to shape each of these into buns by just taking all of the edges and pinching them at the top, and then I'm going to turn it over, roll it against my surface to make the top really nice and smooth, and then I'm going to flatten them and then place them on my baking sheet, and these are going to rise for 30 to 40 minutes. Even though I shaped these hamburger buns second, they are going to be finished rising before the sandwich loaves just because they are smaller. So once those are done, I've preheated my oven to 350 degrees. And I'm going to be brushing each of these buns with my egg wash. I don't always do this, sometimes I leave it plain, but since I already had my egg wash done and out for my cinnamon raisin swirl bread, I figured I might as well go ahead and do this. So I'm gonna egg wash this, and we're gonna sprinkle some sesame seeds on top. The egg wash is going to give it a really nice golden color and also help for any of your toppings like the sesame seeds to stick. These are gonna bake in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes, and this is what they look like when they're done. They turned out really good, and I love that golden color with the sesame seeds. Looks just like a nice store-bought or fancy hamburger bun. And meanwhile, our other loaves have finished rising, so those can go in the oven right after, and the oven's already preheated, so it's really nice to just make these bread recipes back to back. In the beginning, it's really easy to whip up the doughs because I have all of my dough ingredients out, like my flours. They pretty much rise at the same exact time, and then they go in the oven at the same time too, so it's just really handy. The white sandwich bread is done after 30 to 35 minutes, and then the cinnamon raisin one will need 10 to 15 minutes more after that, and I've also tented it with foil about halfway through. And now we can cut into all of this beautiful homemade bread. Everything has cooled off, so I'm going to cut into these hamburger buns first, and they just look so beautiful. The insides are really nice and fluffy, but still a little bit dense so that they won't fall apart. And these are going to be perfect for our sandwiches this week. And I don't even think I'm going to use all of them, so half of them can go in the freezer because bread freezes really nicely. Now cutting into the sandwich bread, here is the white sandwich bread first. I really like this recipe for white sandwich bread. It is fluffy but a little bit dense, just like the hamburger buns. So you could still use it as sandwich bread and like load a ton of fillings in there, and it's not going to break apart. This bread also makes for really good grilled cheese sandwiches, and it's also good for French toast. Actually, both of these are good for French toast, the regular and the cinnamon raisin, so that's a really nice thing to use if you have any extras or if it goes stale. And it's just a really nice basic bread to know how to make. Now for the cinnamon raisin swirl bread. The first couple of pieces on the end usually don't have too much of that swirl, but as you cut in towards the middle, you can see that beautiful cinnamon swirl starting to form. This is Erin's preferred bread for toast in the morning, and I prefer the plain one, which is why I usually do 1 loaf of each. And we usually have this bread every day with our scrambled eggs for breakfast. We'll have eggs and toast, so it's nice to whip up a batch of this every couple of weeks. I can stick half of these into the freezer, and the other half we can just eat fresh for the week. So that's all the prep I did for this week, just the bread and the barbecue sauce. So now we can move into the actual recipes. The first thing I'm going to make are vegetarian pulled pork sandwiches, and I'm starting off by making a slaw. I usually do a cabbage slaw, but I don't have any cabbage, and I decided that I would try doing a radish and carrot slaw instead. I have these homegrown China rose radishes. These are the very last ones of the ones that we harvested back in December from our garden. And they've just been in the fridge this whole time and they're still doing great. They kind of started to sprout a little bit, but they're still nice and firm. And as long as I cut off the ends, they are perfectly good. I also have one large carrot that I'm going to peel. I'm not going to peel the radishes because I want to leave as much of that beautiful skin as possible. And then I'm going to be using this cool tool. This is a julienne peeler. And I'm going to use this to julienne my carrot. Julienning does take a little bit of time, so this peeler makes it a really quick process, and you also get like really nice shaved pieces that are a little bit thinner than what you can get with a knife. And it just makes really quick work of this. This is best to use with long vegetables like this carrot. I can't really use it on the radishes because they're not long enough for me to have anything to hold on to. So those ones I'm just going to julienne by hand, and that's fine too. So here are my radishes and my carrots chopped up. I added some salt to this and I'm just going to mix this in. Sometimes I let the salt sit there for 15 to 20 minutes to draw out some moisture, and then I'll dump out that moisture. But I just wanted to get this done a little quicker today, so I kind of skipped that draining step. And to add to this slaw, I have the juice of half of a lime, which I'm going to squeeze over. And this is basically going to quick pickle these vegetables. The acid from the lime as well as the salt are really going to soften these vegetables down, and you just have to let it sit for like 15 minutes while you prepare the rest of the meal for it to do its work. I usually will also add some fresh herbs to this, like scallions, parsley, or cilantro, but I don't have any of that right now. But I did find some frozen chimichurri in my freezer. I usually freeze this in little ice cubes, so I just microwaved one of those little cubes. And chimichurri is a sauce that has herbs. I usually use cilantro and parsley, and I also usually do red wine vinegar, garlic, and some olive oil. So this has a lot of the ingredients that I want in my slaw anyway, so I thought it would be a great thing to use, and it does give a little bit of that fresh herb flavor that I'm missing as well. Next, I'm going to add a little bit of my homemade sauerkraut. You can see it's kind of like two different colors here because we usually do a normal batch and then a batch with turmeric, and I just mixed both of those batches together when we got to like half a jar, so that's kind of why there's a little bit of a color differentiation. But anyway, I'm just going to take a couple of spoonfuls of that and mix it in, and that is our finished slaw. It turned out so beautiful with those carrots and radishes, such nice bright colors. And now I'm going to move on to the main filling for our sandwiches, which, as I mentioned, is going to be a vegetarian pulled pork. So instead of pork, I'm using this green jackfruit that's canned in water. You want to make sure you get it canned in either water or brine because sometimes it's canned in syrup, and that's not what we want for this. And this is what it looks like. Jackfruit is a really big fruit that grows in tropical climates, and it has basically no taste, so it takes on a lot of flavors that you put it in. And I'm going to shred this with my hands, and as I shred it, you can see how it kind of has like these strands, and when they pull apart they kind of look like the texture of shredded meat. So that's why it is a really good thing to use in place of meat. And we obviously do eat meat. I've shown that we cook with meat sometimes in these videos, but we do tend to eat a lot of vegetarian and plant-based meals as well. So I just thought it would be fun to share this because it's a really easy thing to incorporate, and it's also just a lot quicker than cooking meat too. So it's a really nice weeknight meal. You can just take out a can of this, drain it off, and throw it into your pan. You don't have to worry about marinating or dealing with raw meat, so I just find it really handy for weeknight meals. So I'm just gonna fry this up with my onions. The jackfruit has a lot of moisture in it since it is canned in water, so I want a lot of that moisture to evaporate and get this as dry as possible. And then when I add my barbecue sauce in, it is ready to absorb that delicious sauce that we made. I'm putting about a cup of this barbecue sauce in, and I'm gonna save the rest for later in this week because we are gonna do a meat-based barbecue as well. So I'm just gonna mix that in and just let it thicken up and coat all of that jackfruit really nicely. And that is our super easy vegetarian pulled pork filling. Here is the finished spread for the meal. We have our homemade buns, that jackfruit filling with the delicious homemade barbecue sauce, and our carrot and radish slaw, which the texture of this turned out really good. You can see how those vegetables have softened a little bit, and this was a really nice topping for our sandwiches. It gives a nice fresh flavor and a crunch as well. We also like to have our pulled pork sandwiches with some bread and butter pickles, so I pulled some of those out. And this just turned out to be a really good meal. That barbecue sauce came out so good, and it's definitely one that I'm going to make again. I'll leave a link to that recipe down in the description box because this is not my recipe. And as I showed you, I did make some adjustments, but I think it's a really good one to go off of. For the next meal, I had just opened up that big bag of cornmeal that I ordered last time I ordered from Azure, and I noticed that it was a very coarsely ground cornmeal, so I thought it would be great to make some polenta. I'm taking 1 cup of cornmeal here, and I have 4 cups of liquid. I'm using 2 cups of vegetable broth and 2 cups of water, but you can use straight water if you want to. I think that's actually the most traditional way to make this, but the broth will just add a little bit of extra flavor. And this does tend to clump up quite a bit when you add it to the liquid, so I'm just whisking it to remove any of those lumps. And that's gonna have to simmer for 30 to 40 minutes for that cornmeal to cook and fully hydrate. So after about 20 minutes, I'm going to work on a topping for this polenta. I have some onions and mushrooms. This looks like a lot of mushrooms, but they will cook down a lot. So I'm just gonna let that cook down until everything is starting to brown. And then I have that leftover tomato puree and stuff that I strained out when I was making the barbecue sauce. I saved all of that and I'm using it here. It has a ton of flavor in it. It's kind of like a tomato sauce or tomato paste. And then I'm also adding some frozen cherry tomatoes as well. Between those mushrooms, the onions, and the tomatoes, this is such a flavorful topping for the polenta. And polenta is a little on the plain side. It's almost like a porridge, so it's nice to have something very flavorful to go on top of this. And those cherry tomatoes will just take a little bit of time to cook, but they hold their shape surprisingly well even from frozen. I also managed to harvest a little bit of spinach from the garden, which is amazing. I can't believe there's still spinach out there in the middle of February, so I added that in as well at the very end just so it can wilt down. The polenta is done now. This is the finished consistency. It's definitely scoopable, but when you lift it up, it's not like completely liquid. So let's plate this up. We are going to dollop a few spoonfuls of that polenta, which has a slightly sweet and kind of nutty flavor from that corn, and it's really comforting. You could also add in some Parmesan cheese at the end if you want to make a cheesy polenta. And then we're going to add that mushroom tomato topping on top. And the combination of these two is really good. You have those really strong flavors on the topping that marry with that creamy polenta. Polenta is something that I don't make very often, and every time I do, I just tell myself I need to make it more often because it's so good. And you can switch up the toppings and have something different every time. In the summer, I think it would be nice to have like an eggplant and zucchini topping. You can go like really heavy on the tomatoes and make a tomato sauce, maybe even add some meat into it and make a bolognese sauce. That would go so well on top of this to have something a little bit different from a typical pasta dish. For the next meal, I have some pork spare ribs from a local farm, and I've marinated this overnight with a couple of cups of that barbecue sauce. And I'm going to be baking this low and slow in the oven. If it was summer, then you could throw this on the grill, but since it's winter, the oven's going to be just fine. I'm throwing this in a 275-degree oven covered with aluminum foil, and that's going to cook for about 2 hours. After that, I'm going to remove the foil and add a cup more of the barbecue sauce on top and just slather it all on top, and this is going to go under the broiler for 5 to 10 minutes until everything has that nice char on top, so you almost get like that grill flavor even though we're doing this in the oven. And all of those sugars in the barbecue sauce caramelize really nicely under the broiler or the grill, and you get a really nice crust on top while the inside should be nice and juicy since we cooked this really low. and in a moist environment since it was covered for the first couple of hours. And I know that there are a lot of different ways to do barbecue. This is just a very simple way, marinating it in that barbecue sauce. There are different kinds where you can do some kind of dry rub and do a dry style of barbecue, and this is obviously not it. I am honestly not an expert on barbecue, but I can say that these turned out really delicious and we really enjoyed them. To finish off this barbecue meal, I have some buttered green beans and corn, both of which are from the freezer, and then I made up some biscuits as well. For the last meal, I'm going to be making up some egg noodle soup, and I'm going to try making these noodles from scratch. I'm using 2 cups of flour, 2 eggs, and half a teaspoon of salt. And these are going to be egg noodles. I am trying to make kind of like an udon noodle style dish, but with egg noodles instead. Udon noodles usually just have flour and water, but because we have so many eggs, I wanted to try this out because if I can incorporate some of our eggs in there, it's just another good way to be able to use them up. So I'm using my food processor for this. You can do this by hand, just like how you would make like an Italian style pasta. But I thought I would try using my food processor because that will take out a lot of the work for me and I don't have to do most of that kneading. The food processor will do a lot of the work. So I have a dough blade in here, and with those 2 eggs, I pulsed everything together, but there wasn't quite enough liquid yet, so I'm drizzling in water little by little until everything forms a nice mass that rolls around in the food processor. And I'm going to keep processing that for a couple of minutes until a lot of that gluten has formed and the dough gets really smooth. After I take it out of the food processor, I'm going to give it just a couple of kneads with my hand to make sure that everything is kneaded very nicely and smoothed out. And when you press into it, it should bounce back. That's how you know enough gluten has formed. Typically, if you're kneading by hand, this will take a good like 10 to 15 minutes. So using that food processor really helps to cut out some of that work and that time. I'm going to cover this with a damp towel for at least 30 minutes for that gluten to relax. Normally you would wrap this in plastic wrap, but I try not to use plastic wrap whenever possible. And after 30 minutes, I'm taking it out and I'm going to roll this out with a rolling pin. For Italian pasta, I would normally use a pasta roller because you have to get it really thin, but the style of noodles that I'm trying to make are on the thicker side. If you've had udon noodles, they're super thick and like really chewy, so I am just going to roll this out until it's maybe 1/8 of an inch thick, so definitely not thin enough for you to see through, and they're also going to puff up after I cook them as well. And this is just an experiment. I've never done egg noodles this thick before, but I figured I would try it out, and it's pretty easy to do this by hand since I'm not trying to get it paper thin. You can see this dough is rolling out really nicely because we gave it that time to rest. If you had tried to roll this out immediately after kneading, it would keep bouncing back and it really wouldn't want to stretch out. So if you find that happening, just cover it back up and let it rest for 15 more minutes before you try rolling it out again. After it is the thickness that I think I want it to be, I'm going to fold it in half and use a pizza cutter to cut out some noodles. You can do this with a knife, but I find it a little bit easier to get straight lines with the pizza cutter. And this is the finished thickness of the noodles. I realized that I forgot to flour in between my layers when I folded, so I'm going to do that now because it really helps to prevent sticking as I cut this. And after I do a few strands, I also like to kind of like separate them and fluff them out and coat them with more flour so that this minimizes some of the sticking. To really stop them from sticking, you can use like cornstarch or potato starch. That helps a lot better because it doesn't get absorbed into the noodles the same way. But since I'm just doing a small amount, the flour is fine because I'm going to be boiling these almost right away, so they're not going to be sitting on my board for a long time. After I've finished cutting all of my noodles out, I have a pot of water that's already boiling and I'm going to dunk these noodles in there. Fresh pasta usually cooks really quickly. So if this was really thin spaghetti kind of pasta, it would only go in there for like 2 minutes. But these are pretty hefty noodles, so they will take a little bit longer. And you'll know when they're just about done because they'll get really puffy. They'll start to look very different. And when I start to see that like puffy pillowiness, I will test one and just make sure it's cooked all the way through. And once it is, I can take these out and put them into our bowls for our dinner. When I cooked them that first night, I think I did kind of undercook them. They weren't super flexible, and the next day when I reheated them, I really let them go for a long time and they were a lot easier to eat. So I think longer is better with these thicker noodles. And that's something I'll keep in mind for the next time I make them. After the noodles are cooked, I poured out any of that cooking liquid that was left over and I'm going to be heating up my broth in the same pot. For the broth for this noodle bowl, I have a quart of dashi that was from my freezer. Dashi is a Japanese broth that is usually made with kelp and bonito flakes, which is smoked and dried tuna. It is an incredible broth with so much flavor. You would never believe how much flavor you can get out of just those 2 ingredients, and it produces a really smoky and deep flavor. I'm also adding some frozen greens. I believe this is either kale or turnip greens, as well as some frozen green onions to this broth. That's just going to take a couple of minutes to heat up, and then we can pour it over our fresh egg noodles. That hot broth is going to help to just kind of rewarm those noodles up a little bit, and they'll soak in a lot of that broth flavor since we don't have any extra cooking liquid to dilute it down. I also added some soy sauce and sesame oil to finish off this broth, and I added a tea egg on top as well. To be honest, that first night I kind of thought that these noodles were a failure because, like I said, I did kind of undercook them and I didn't realize how long they should actually be cooked. They weren't terrible, they still tasted good, they were just like a little bit difficult to eat. And at first I thought that I wasn't going to make these again and I would just stick to udon noodles. But after the next day, I've changed my mind and I do think that they're worth making as long as they're fully cooked. And I'm really happy to have a really simple way to make fresh egg noodles without having to bring out my pasta roller. And it's super easy to do by hand. So I hope you guys enjoyed another video of pantry challenge meals. I'll have 1 or 2 more of these videos for you before the challenge is over, so subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you again in the next video.